Well, the government's reform bill has survived the night and passed in the House of Commons, but only after yet more last-minute concessions in a humiliating episode for the Prime Minister. So, Tom, maybe kick things off for us. Short of the vote being pulled, this is really as bad as it gets for the government, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, I suppose defeat would be worse. But this is, it's pretty much a defeat, I think.
Yeah.
I think, Will, we were joking around. Well, we were trying to work this out last night, and you figured out that if they hadn't done anything on winter fuel and these welfare changes, they would be in a better fiscal position than they are today.
They spent quite a lot of money in normal person terms not doing anything at all, because the winter fuel U-turn, the net fiscal effect with that was that they persuaded large numbers of people that they needed to sign up for pension credit, which is actually really good, because there were hundreds of thousands of people who were entitled to pension credit who weren't getting it because they didn't know they could get it. So it was a great public information campaign for that. But it's probably a few £100 million worth of extra pension credit per year now being paid out as a result of that. And obviously they didn't really get the money back from the winter fuel. And then in this case, it may also end up being that, they end up spending more money than they were originally going to because of the other changes to universal credit. So you've got a sort of £1.7 billion cut in one place, and then you've got a £1.8 billion increase on the other hand with the universal credit. So it was only really the PIP changes that were going to save money. And so it is, again, it's going to end up costing a little bit of money for the government to do basically nothing.
Wow.
I mean, I think that is pretty bad. So I think we can say it's basically a defeat. And I think it's almost just worth winding back to first principles and thinking, how are we here already? 1 year in, 165 seat majority. But even saying 165 seat majority, I think in some ways underplays the strength that the Labour Party should be in right now, but in parliamentary terms, that they have more than 400 MPs. The Conservative Party are down at 120. And not just that, but they are almost irrelevant in the public sort of mind, in the consciousness, in the polls, in their kind of impact, their importance. The leader of the opposition now is Nigel Farage, in effect, and he has 5 MPs. And yet, from this position, Labour can't do anything. And I do think it kind of comes back to this point where, is this a fiscal measure or is this a moral measure about getting people back into work? What is it that this government is trying to do? Where are they heading? What direction? And why is it that people aren't following them? And I sort of wonder whether it's we talk about narrative a lot, storytelling and all that kind of stuff. But it is a sense of, this is the point of the government. And if you follow us there, we will win and we will change the country. And, selfishly, you might become a minister and you might help us change the country. None of them believe that. None of them know where they're going. None of them think they're going to win their seats the next election, or very few of them think that now. And so it's all collapsing. It's kind of just ludicrous.
I think you're right, because they keep talking about reform, especially in terms of the health service. They want to be a reforming government, not just a government that spends more or cuts spending more. Yeah. But what struck me about this welfare sort of debacle over the weeks that it's played out is that these aren't really reforms, are they? They're just, there's a few bits and bobs that the Labour MPs are supporting in terms of helping people, have a go at trying a job before getting back into work and those kind of things. But really, it's just taking in its original form, taking more benefits off more claimants. And that's been tried and tried. There's this document that everyone wants to get hold of that isn't public. We think it exists in the DWP from 2017 when they tried sort of cutting sickness benefits. What was the result of that in terms of getting people back into work? That hasn't been made public. That should tell us something. It's been tried by successive Conservative governments and it hasn't worked. What we needed to see from this Labour government, if it was going to tell a true story about what it wanted to do for the country, was an actual package of reforms. I was just speaking to a Labour MP who was supportive of the original bill, who said, you know, if only they had actually done something a bit more radical and come up with a real plan of reforming the welfare system wholesale from first principles, rather than, you know, just going in mainly with those cuts to PIP claimants.
What do you think of the, because you're all over the detail, you understand it far better than I do, but I know that I hear the people close to Starmer set it out, and they set it out in a way I think that is like more persuasive, or at least more passionate and kind of understandable when they're speaking privately. And they will either talk about a kind of sense of hopelessness that's fallen over the country. It's kind of like there's this thick fog of hopelessness and sort of despair, and that they think that is kind of fundamental to the problems in the country, and that you see more and more people in their telling are either are sort of stuck in depressed places, economically depressed, I mean, that are then signing on to sickness benefits, or they say the sort of more able ones, the ones with qualifications, are heading off to Dubai. We're just leaving the country altogether. And so you have this kind of sort of sense of despair. That's like one telling. And the other one is like this kind of quite an interesting one from the Treasury's perspective, which is we're pumping money into the health service, probably not enough, but 30 billion, I think. Is it 30 billion they're pumping in? And they're saying, and we're supposed to accept a system in which we kick out more people that aren't fit for work. So like how, and that's their argument, but is it credible?
Do you know what? I have a problem with this kind of framing of it, because I think that welfare, and, you know, I'm not making a judgment of whether this is good or bad. It may be extremely concerning to the government that this is what's happened, but welfare has become more and more mainstream. So since the COVID pandemic, more and more people came into contact with the social security system, either through furlough or through the support for self-employed people or through universal credit. You saw a massive increase in claimants to universal credit, to the extent that even places that aren't, you know, stuck in that cycle of despair. So I went to the constituency of Mid Bedfordshire. That is the place with the highest percentage of PIP claimants who are working. And all of these people who I was interviewing, you know, coming in and out of the job centre, you know, getting along with their life on the high street, were absolutely incensed by what the Labour government wanted to do, because they said this would actually make it less likely for me to be able to stay in work or get a better job or, you know, increase my hours, because it would sort of, you know, hobble my independence. So I think Labour's kind of misread the mood in the country. You can see this in some of the polling as well, across parties, including Reform. People are just kind of repulsed by this idea that people who can't wash themselves below the waist or can't cook their own meal would have their lives made harder by these cuts. So I think they've misjudged where people are at, and it's not just sort of the most deprived, the most severely disabled, the most deprived. It's also people who, you know, they're using PIP to get along with their lives, which is exactly what it was for. Anyone can claim it. You know, it's not a means-tested benefit.
Are you saying that you were, at the start of that answer, you saying you are uncomfortable with benefits becoming more mainstream, or you think that's a good thing? Because if you think back to the Tony Blair mantra, it was that if you make public services only for the poor, they will become poor public services. And so if you have more universal kind of, if you get more people using public services, you know, state schools, state hospitals, all that, they will just naturally get better, because we'll demand that they're better. And so if we are more in contact with welfare in any guise, then we're going to say, well, you know, so I imagine, like, I don't think I could pay my mortgage on benefits. Like, so it's almost, but if you had a system where I felt that it would protect me, would I be more like naturally kind of sympathetic to it, inclined to it, sort of understanding of it? Because I'd be like, that's my welfare system as well.
Yeah, well, you can see the attitudes have changed. So in 2021, kind of the second year of the pandemic, for the first time in 2 decades, the number of people who felt benefits were too low crossed the number of people who felt that they were too high. So I think that mainstreaming of welfare, everyone knows someone who relies on PIP or uses universal credit to top up their income, that kind of thing, has meant that there is more sympathy towards claimants, which ultimately means that reforms like this have to be made extremely carefully. So I'm not making a judgment on whether it's a good or bad thing, but I think the government is still living in that, you know, period of benefit scroungers in the tabloids. Strivers versus skivers was George Osborne's kind of rhetoric, and there's this assumption that people think that everyone's cheating and taking the piss, but actually I think that's a little bit retro, and the country's moved on.
Yeah.
Megan?
I think there's another point around the fact that, the welfare system, other elements of the social safety net have been sort of degraded to an extent that actually, sort of public health services that would help people rehabilitate back into work are sort of non-existent at this stage, because local government budgets have been cut by sort of a quarter since, I think, the Cameron and Osborne days. So those kinds of, in the community, preventative measures don't really exist in the way that they used to. So welfare, because it is that sort of, it's seen as like a handout. I'm not saying that it is, but, it's been maintained and it's more accessible. I think it's more of a target and is seen as sort of, it still exists, so it can be cut, whereas those other elements of the social safety net have been cut already. So it's sort of the last thing in the process. So I think the government, it's maybe not something that they could do immediately. So that's why it's not something that's happening. We're not discussing it right now. It would take a lot longer, but that's what where I think the focus should be. And I think a lot of Labour MPs, they were councillors or they grew up politically, especially in the 2024 intake, the new MPs there, during the austerity years. So they've come in thinking, okay, I want to make a change. I don't want to be cutting budgets or cutting people's benefits. But now they're at a stage where the government's saying, well, that's what you're going to have to do. So I think levelling up is what needs to happen. And Labour are kind of talking about that. They've come up with sort of their own version of it. But that takes a lot longer than, needing to fill a fiscal black hole in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
So,
and what are Labour MPs saying, Megan? Because you've been speaking to them, for weeks about this.
Yeah, I think obviously about a week ago there was the reasoned amendment from Meg Hillier. So there was a lot of consternation then. I think it was sort of what I was just saying about people feeling that we are a Labour government. Labour government shouldn't be cutting benefits from disabled people.
Which is a reasonable starting place.
Yeah, which is...
And actually, to be honest, like the stories that I was hearing from these working PIP claimants, literally crying and shaking in some instances, that's what all of these Labour MPs will be getting from their constituents as well. So it's like very affecting.
Yeah.
But it's amazing that it came from Meg Hillier, though, because, she spent 10 years running the Public Accounts Committee. Like, she is one of the people you would sort of pick, in Parliament as like an absolute paragon of like good spending and fiscal discipline. But in a way, she also sort of illustrates the point that Megan was making about, the mantra of the Public Accounts Committee and organisations like the National Audit Office. There is always that you spend early and you will save money. Like public health spending really pays off. Yeah. Way more than spending on hospitals. So like good fiscal discipline isn't making cuts at the sharp end. It's like, spending well in advance and having a long-term plan for these things.
There was a good piece by Sam Friedman over the weekend, probably in a rival publication that I shouldn't be promoting. But he said something to the effect of, we've got to a place, like a state in the country in the health service, where you can't do that anymore. So you can't, we have endless reports about the health service in particular saying, right, we've got to stop spending on hospitals and we've got to get people out of hospitals into treat them in the community. And actually the hospitals are so broken now that it's just not really reasonable to do that. So you have to even get to the point that you're talking about, you have to start getting everything else in order first. Yeah. And that's where we're at.
But I guess, the government would argue that they are sort of doing that, but the big part of this, welfare reform package that people don't talk about is all of this money that is being put in the NHS with the objective of getting people back into work, training of thousands and thousands of new staff to help people with mental health and that kind of thing, directly to address this problem in the labour market of lots of young people falling out of employment, often due to mental health problems. And but that doesn't seem to have been talked about much because it's all about, the attempt to save £5.5 billion from PIP claimants.
Yeah, and actually, Will, your cover story this week gives us a flavour of what the government could be doing instead of trying to make these sort of tweaks around the edges to save money. Can you give us an exclusive about what it's about?
I can give you an exclusive on the reaction to the piece from Lord Frost now of The Telegraph, which our listeners will be very familiar with. I'm sure it's the first paper they turn to. It's called us deranged leftists.
Should I put that on the banner?
Yeah.
I'm going to put it on my business card.
A magazine of the deranged leftists. Since
1930.
So if you're within a few miles of SW1, you will have heard Lord Frost's jowls shaking as he observed the New Statesman front cover this morning, the sound of marmalade spattering across richly upholstered carpets, and the temerity of the suggestion that we should raise tax. But that is obviously what the government is going to have to do.
What taxes exactly should the government be raising?
Well, the first thing to do, I think, is the government needs to do is to recognise that the tax system as it currently stands is a weird system of compromises and workarounds and, the results of lots of different legal cases about which kinds of people should pay tax and, whether a Jaffa cake is a biscuit and all this kind of thing.
Or an ice cream cone.
Exactly, yeah. And so we have ended up a bit like with our, organically produced constitution. We have ended up with a system where things don't really work. There are lots of weird incentives, and in which people think that they pay a lot of tax in the UK, and in a lot of cases they don't. Some people pay a lot of tax in the UK, but some people, the average earner, doesn't. Okay, so economists use this measure called the tax wedge, which is the sort of percentage of labour costs that actually goes back out again as tax.
Okay.
Which allows them to look at other countries and say, because obviously all countries have different tax systems and they can be quite complex, especially ours, and that allows them to sort of say exactly how much money goes back out again and goes to the state. And across the OECD countries, of which I think there are about 40 countries in the OECD, the average is around 35%. Average in Western Europe is probably around 40%. Sort of Germany and France, well over 45%. Canada, Japan in the early 30s. USA, something a little bit over 30. The UK, the tax wedge on a single worker on average income is 29.4%. So it's lowest in the G7, one of the lowest in the OECD. So basically, like, average single worker in the UK is paying the state a smaller proportion than almost every other country in the sort of major economies. And why do people think that we pay a lot of tax? Well, firstly, because the tax burden, so-called, is really high. It's a multi-decade high. But that's because some people are paying a lot of tax and businesses are paying a lot of tax. And but, kind of middle earners have to a certain extent been sort of radicalised by that fact into thinking they're paying way too much tax. But in fact, the basic rate of income tax has not risen at all for 50 years. And instead what we have is all these sort of stealth taxes and compromises. And all of those taxes are, they put more pressure on people. They make them feel more taxed, but they're often counterproductive. So they do things like, they chip away more at growth than just, blunt, honest raises in income tax would do. So you have things like in the last budget, Rachel Reeves, having promised not to, raise taxes on working people, having promised not to raise income tax, national insurance, or VAT, which are three big revenue-raising taxes, then raised employers' national insurance. And obviously, the OBR then released its forecast, which immediately said, most of that is going to be paid by workers, because what companies obviously do is they pay the workers less. Everyone gets a lower pay rise, or it takes longer to get a pay rise, and companies also hire less. So you get more of a dent in the economy because it was more politically convenient to say, no, we're not raising income tax. But they are.
The thing that I found so dispiriting, I don't know about you guys, but in Will's piece, was even though it was written in a sort of jocular way that made me laugh a lot, just the sort of dishonesty of it and the sense that, as you sort of spell it out there, we have these taxes that remain relatively stable and sort of relatively normal or just below normal in the, among our sort of European peers. And then we just have these obvious pressures. I think you set them out in the piece. Like, we're getting older, which is a good thing. As we're living longer, we need more support as we get older. So everyone knows that. It's obvious. And then you look at all the other things that we're having to pay, like the defence costs. So Keir Starmer's promised to go to 3.5%, is it? And then 5% above that. So that's more money that we have to find. And then there's all the other things that are going, the energy transition, that we are told by Keir Starmer is a key priority of his. And we're going to spend, 20 billion pounds on Sizewell nuclear reactor, which we should have done 20 years ago. But that's still, we have to find that money. And then just nothing about the tax system. But like the most dispiriting thing I felt was that sense of, when you walk around the country and you know something's off, it's just like, this isn't right. Like, if you go to France or you go to northern Spain or something on holiday and you walk around a town and you're like, how come all these shops are independent shops and they look nice and they look clean and the streets are well maintained, and you go into them and they seem to be living, like earning a reasonable living to live a reasonable life by selling stuff in a shop in a town centre that looks nice. How come we don't have that when we're supposed to be richer than these places? Like, we're evidently not richer than these places because they've got it. It's clearly wealthier. It's more prosperous. It's sort of, they've somehow got a balance right that we haven't got. And you read Will's piece, you're like, oh my God, it's because of the tax system. We've just got it.
It's business rates, it's council tax, it's the fact that the local
Deliveroo thing.
Yeah. So they, business rates are sort of always, they are shops being taxed as if they are from the more prosperous past. They're 4 years out of date. They're based on rent valuations that are out of date. So as the high street declines, it's still being taxed as if it was, sort of 4 years better off. But the, empty properties and charity shops don't get charged business rates. Empty properties can do some of the time, but so you get the tax system constructing a high street in which that you get a lot of empty properties and charity shops in which some shops will be paying the council more than they're paying the people to stand in the shop and sell the stuff. And then you get the council is still broke because it's also the other revenue raising measure it's got is council tax, which is this sort of weird regressive system where it's kind of, for somebody on low income, it can be absolutely loads of money and lots of people can't afford to pay it. For somebody who is very well off, it's an absolute pittance and it doesn't matter. So it's a regressive tax. And also, it's not council tax, it's social care tax. It pays for the social care system. It obviously shouldn't. Like, it's weirdly hypothecated in that sense.
There is a social care premium within the council tax allocation. But you're right. It's like 80% of council budgets go on social care.
That's the other thing, right? So that's the other depressing thing when you read Will's piece, like the obviousness, like facing us all as we go about our daily lives and we walk down our streets and they look ugly. They've like the paving stones have been replaced by like a splodge of tarmac because they can't afford to do it. I was walking through my local park the other day, and the bins have been replaced by just like a bit of wire and sort of like two bits of wire sticking out the ground and some plastic bags. And like, what on earth is going on?
Like, money well spent. And actually, that is, I was joking, but that is an important point. Your piece is great, Will, But saying just raise tax, it is tricky, isn't it? Because people feel that they're paying too much tax already because they don't feel they're getting something in return from it.
Yeah.
I think that's the big political issue with trying to raise taxes, because you just, like you say, you just go about your daily life and you're like, what am I getting for this? And if you do go on holiday to one of the European countries that you mentioned, you just see that things work so much better.
Yeah. There are also huge problems with how effective public spending is.
Yeah.
It's like one of the other big trends in British public spending in recent decades is the amount of stuff the state pays other people to do. So outsourcing went from, I think, sort of 29-10, it was somewhere around 50 billion. I think it's more than quadrupled since then. So, there are a lot of questions to be asked about the efficiency of the state delivering things in that way. But that all adds up to what appears to be a bigger state, which a lot of people don't like. So we pay huge amounts of money for political convenience at every step of the way.
Do you think, right, just an overall question, when you look at this, as Will's basically saying, right, you can't tinker anymore. Like it's got too far. And then what we're left with is finding these specific taxes that will get some money from specific people or cutting stuff from specific people. So you end up smashing farmers and the pensioners and the disabled, and every time you get hit over the head, and that you need to do a much bigger systemic thing. But do you think, and I think this comes back to the central point of this government, is that Keir Starmer doesn't think the system is broken? And that's what he said to me in that profile that I did a few weeks ago. And that may be right. So maybe it takes like lots of small fixes and we eventually get to look like, Oviedo or something. Or what do you think, Anoosh? Do you think, is it broken? Is there something like fundamentally broken in the setup of this country that requires a kind of a sort of revolution of either the tax code or the way we fund public services or the way we do politics or the economy? Because I think that's the kind of the fundamental question sort of hanging over this government.
It's hard for me to say that the country is broken when I've got, family in Lebanon who basically are living in a failed state. So I think sometimes you do need to have a bit more of a sense of perspective. And actually being on maternity leave, I came into contact with the state far more than I usually would have done. Luckily, I've been a healthy person in my life, so I haven't had to have too much contact with hospitals. And, obviously I use the children's centres and things. And it was quite humbling because I've spent my whole career writing about, how the public realm is being degraded and public services are vanishing around areas. But actually, I was quite impressed with the services that I came into contact with. And, the children's centres are brilliant around where I live. And obviously going into hospital and having the follow-up care in hospital, it did feel understaffed and sort of overrun and, things took time, but the quality of care was good. So I think we need to be careful, not to just sort of trash the whole country. But there are so many things that are broken, which are listed in Will's piece, like this ludicrous council tax, business rates, things that successive governments haven't, had the courage to touch. Social care is a major one. That you do think there's something broken in the way that sort of politicians just don't seem to be able to grapple with with the too difficult box, I think it's sometimes called. So I think maybe it's more of a failing of the political class rather than sort of the country being broken in general, because when you speak to people who work in public services, when you use public services yourself, everyone's trying their best with what they have to work with. It's just that the revenue stream is that is broken. I think that's probably part of it that is broken.
I think with the social care stuff, it's more of like an attitude problem from the public, because obviously we have had an attempt. Boris Johnson made his attempt to raise taxes to pay for social care. I mean, it wasn't wholly successful because it, eventually got cut, but also the money was going to go through the NHS first and then to social care, which is a silly system because the NHS famously just sucks up all the money.
Yeah.
But, it was that thing of 1.25% on national insurance as the health and social care levy, which was the only victim of that actually succeeded of Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget, all the tax cuts. It was the only one that actually got cut.
As in stayed cut?
As in stayed cut, yeah. As in,
That's great, isn't it? That's the national,
continued.
national
Jeremy
priorities.
Hunt kept it when he became chancellor.
So the one thing that Jeremy Hunt, former health secretary, kept
who
was
has
a cut
campaigned
to
on social
NHS
care.
funding.
And he has said since to me twice in interviews on this podcast that he regrets the social care cuts.
Yeah.
Then he went into the election just pulling the same trick. I think a lot of sort of sensible Tories get away with this, the sensible in quotes, that they sort of they try to make themselves more respectable out of office to the left through this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there is definitely a lazy nostalgia on the left or the liberal left for those times, you know, Cameron.
Exactly.
The person who sort of summed up the reason why getting a tax like that through he summed it up so succinctly at the COVID inquiry was actually George Osborne, who said that there's this sense in the country that we can't decide between, okay, social care is going to cost us a lot of money because we're all getting, you know, the life expectancy is increasing, whatever. Either we're going to have to decide between, do you sell your house to pay for your care? Does all your inheritance go on it? Or do we raise taxes and pay for it that way? We can't, and it's such an unpalatable decision, or it seems to be with the public, that we just can't do it. And I think that sums up like a sort of more general thing about sort of what Will was saying. People feel they're already really highly taxed. As Will said, they're actually not. But it's that sense of, oh, you're going to raise my taxes. What are you doing? Am I actually going to get... There's not that trust that then they'll get the better service. Yeah. So, you know, I can see why it's difficult.
This comes back to the systemic point. I think that somebody said to me that when the NHS was founded, like the biggest fear that hung over people was like childbirth and early years care. Yeah. That this was like if you were poor, that was like an existential fear that you had about how to manage that sort of medical process and all of the needs that you know. And now when we have kids, we just sort of we're covered. We don't have that fear, and as you say, like you get the visit from the health service, the midwife, and all of that, and you're like, wow, this system. This is nice. I feel reassured that somebody's come and checked on me. And is it like day one or day three or something? I can't remember.
When you're just like barely dressed.
Yeah, you feel quite judged. But it's like, you know, at least you know that you're sort of safe. But since then, the fear has shifted entirely in the other way. And actually the setup of the NHS then was that there was nothing on that end-of-life care. And that's remained the settlement, even though that is now clearly like the major fear in all of our lives. And so like the system hasn't kept up with the reality of life. So the challenge is fundamentally a systemic one, but nobody has been brave enough to deal with it at all.
No.
Successive governments.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to really what the major criticism of this government is, which is you were talking about earlier, Tom, which is the lack of, you know, stomach for a proper radical change, lack of conviction, lack of sort of ideology. I think that's what you need to be a government different from the last ones who haven't touched sort of any of these subjects we've just been talking about.